Hello, and welcome back to the next video. In this video, we're going to be talking about React component lifecycles and how you can use the useEffect hook to run code when your component either mounts or updates. Now, with typical class components, you used to have functions called component.didMount and component.didUpdate. And in those functions, you could define some code that gets run whenever your component updates or whenever your component first mounts. However, for functional components, we'll use a function called useEffect, which you can pull out of React. And then there we can define some code that you would want to run when your component mounts, and you could also define some variables when you would want the component to update. Now, using useEffect for when the component mounts is especially useful for when you're using an async function, such as an API call to grab data from somewhere else, and it's also useful for when some of the values in your state change. So in this video, we're going to go through an example of both of those. So first to start, all I have here is my create React app. We went over this in the previous video, but if you want to create a new React app, you can just run npx create-react-app, and then the name of your app. In this case, I named mine Lifecycle, because that's what we'll be talking about in this video. Now, in order to run our app, all we have to type is npm start, and then once our app is finished compiling, then it should be available on localhost 3000. So if we go to the browser, we'll see that we have our basic template for a create React app application. Now let's go ahead and go into our app.js, and up here we're just going to import the function useEffect from React. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and call our useEffect function. In order to do that, you'll have to call that before the return statement in your functional component. So here we'll just say useEffect, and useEffect takes in two parameters. The first is a function, and the second parameter is just an array. Now we'll talk about the array in a second, but the first thing is this function is what gets run during your component lifecycle. So I mentioned before that useEffect is used in replacement of component.didMount and component.didUpdate. And this function essentially defines the code that you would want to run in either of those cases. Now this array here is where we specify a list of variables where when those values change, we want to run this function. If we leave it blank, then that means that this useEffect will only run on component.didMount. So useEffect is a great place for you to add async functions, where you need to pull data from somewhere else. And for this example, we're going to be fetching post data from a mock API. So if we go to the browser and you go to jsonplaceholder.typecode.com, then you'll see that this is a free fake API for testing and prototyping. So for example, if you scroll down here and we want to get posts, you could just make an API call to jsonplaceholder.typecode.com/posts, and you'll get all of this information. In addition, if you want to get a specific post, you could do /post/1 to get just that single post. And this is just what we're going to be using in our example. So if we go back to our VS Code, let's go ahead and create a state variable for posts. So up here, besides useEffect, let's also pull out useState, which is what we talked about in the last video, in order to create a state variable for our component. And the way that we do that is we say const, and then square brackets, the name of our variable, which in this case, our state variable is going to be called posts, and then a function name that's going to set the value of posts. And then we'll set this equal to useState, which takes in this initial value, which is an empty array, for this state post variable. Now inside of our useEffect, we're going to make a fetch call in order to get all the posts from this API. As you can see, this API returns a list of various post objects. And each post object has a user ID, a post ID, a title, and a body. So in order to make an API call, we can just use the fetch command, and then we'll pass in the URL that's going to return our data, which in this case is just this URL. Since fetch is an async function, then afterwards we have to do .then, and that's going to return a response. And we want to take that response and turn it into JSON. And res.json is also going to be an async function, which is going to spit out data. And then we want to set posts to be the value of data. And that's how we're going to populate our post state variable. So let's go over this code really quickly if you're not familiar with the fetch function. So fetch is a built-in JavaScript function that essentially makes an API call to the URL that you paste in here. And the response that you get back from that API call comes back as res, which is short for response. And then we want to take that response and call this function .json on it, and that will convert a response into a JSON object. And once that's done, it's going to pass it into this variable data, and all we want to do is call setPosts on that data. And that's how we're going to populate this post state variable. So essentially, after the function inside of this useEffect finishes running, we will now have a value for this post state variable. And it will be the JSON object representation of the data that comes back from this fetch function. So now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and actually use our posts. So down here, I'm just going to create an h1 function, and I'm just going to type in posts. And then underneath it, I'm going to have squiggly brackets, which means I'm going to start running some JavaScript code. And I'm just going to call posts.map. And then map takes a callback function. And the callback function is going to run for each post inside of posts. So my parameter is just going to be post. And then my function is essentially just going to return a div for each of my posts. And inside each of the divs, I'm just going to pull out the post.title and the post.body, which corresponds to the attributes that you see inside these objects. Now, every time that you call the map function and you return some HTML, you have to use a key prop to specify that each of these elements that you're rendering are different from each other. And the key for us is just going to be post.id, because that's unique for each of our posts. So I'm actually going to go ahead and make my post body paragraph tags instead of h3 tags. Go ahead and save this file and go back to our browser, and we'll see here we have a list of all the posts that get returned from this JSON placeholder. So to verify this, let's take a look at the title of our first post. It's going to be sunt aut farser. And if we go over here, we'll see that indeed the very first post inside of this list is sunt aut farser, and with this corresponding body. The second post is titled chi est esse. And if we go back here, we'll see that that is the second post. So essentially, we've pulled all the posts from our API call and rendered them on our page using React. When our component renders for the first time, it's in the mounting phase, which is the first step of the component lifecycle. And that's when it calls this useEffect. Inside the useEffect, we say make a call to this API, and that API returns this list of objects. Next, we say take that list of objects and turn it into JSON data, and then let's go ahead and call this setPostState function to set that JSON object to this variable of posts. Now what happens is we take this post state variable and we're using it inside of our React component. And inside of here, we're calling the map JavaScript function on the post variable. The map function takes a callback function as a parameter, and in that callback function, we're rendering a div for each of our posts, and inside of each of those divs, we're rendering the post title and the post body. And that's how we end up with this on our browser. This is post number 1, this is post number 2, this is post number 3, and so on. Now, this is a common practice for you to call async functions inside of a useEffect function, especially on mounting of the component. But let's say now that we want to get a specific post from this API, and we want the user to be able to select what that post is. So if we go back to the JSON placeholder website, we see that it also has this route where we can specify specifically an ID for a post that we want. So in this case, we made a request to get post with ID 1, and this is what comes back. If I change this to say post 2, then you see that this post has ID 2, and the title and body are different. If I change this to post 3, then this is a different post. So essentially what we want to do is we want to give the user the option to select which post they want to see. And this is an excellent opportunity for us to pass a variable into our useEffect so that our page re-renders when that variable changes. Let's go through that example. So here, instead of posts plural, let's change this so that it's just a singular post, and the initial state is just going to be an empty object. Now, in addition, we're going to have to change this API call, because here, instead of /posts, we're going to want to do /posts/ a number. So in this case, we can change our API URL to now use dash quotes, and after this post, we're going to put a slash, we're going to do $, squiggly brackets, and inside of here, we can put our variable. And this variable is going to be the post ID that we want to retrieve from the API. Now up here, let's go ahead and create another state variable. And here we're going to have the state variable be called post ID to match the variable that's in our URL. And then we're going to use setPostID to change that state variable. And we're just going to set the initial state of that variable to be 1. Now down here in our HTML, because posts is no longer a list and it's just a single object, we can go ahead and get rid of the map function and just use our post variable. And now this post variable that we're referencing in our HTML is this state variable that we created up here on line 6. So after we make our API call using the fetch function to this URL, it gets the response back and converts it into JSON. And when we get that response, we're going to call setPost. This should be setPost singular to match this setPost. And we're going to setPost equal to that object, which if our post ID was 3 would be this object. So if we go ahead and save that and we refresh our browser, then we see now we only have one post. and that post title is this, and that post body is this. And that title and body correspond to the post with ID 1. If I go here and I change the initial state of post ID to be 2, and we save, and we go back to our browser, we see that now we have a different post with a different title and a different body. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to give the user the ability to select which post ID they want. In order to do that, we have to ask the user to input information into a text input somewhere. So here above our post, let's go ahead and create an input. So here I've created my text input and I've given it this label, enter a post ID. And now for this text input, we want to give it an onChange. And so what we also need is we're going to need another state variable to keep track of the value that's stored inside this input. So up here at the top, I went ahead and created another state variable. This one's just called value input. And in order to change the value, you have to call the function setInputValue. And the initial state is just an empty string. So now what we want to do is create an onChange function so that when our HTML input value changes, we can change the state variable's value. So here I'm going to go ahead and create a new function, and we'll just call it onInputChange. And when this function is called, we want to call setInputValue, and we want to pass in event.target.value, which is going to be the value that's inside of our text input. Now in order to hook this up, we just need to copy this function, and down here we'll add an onChange prop, and we'll set that equal to our function. Now that we've hooked that up, we've successfully given a way to change the state variable. Now the next thing that we have to do is we also have to change this post ID if we want to get a different post. And we can use this setPostID function in order to do that. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and create a button underneath of our input, and let's add an onClick prop to this button. Now this onClick function is essentially what's going to set off this setPostID function. So up here, let's create another function, and we'll call it onButtonClick. And when this function gets called, we just want to call setPostID equal to our input value. To hook this up to our button, let's go down here to our onClick, and we'll just pass in onButtonClick. So to walk through this really quickly, essentially when we click this button, then we call this function. And when this function runs, we're calling setPostID and setting it equal to the input value, which we've already established is the value inside of our text input. The way that the value inside the text input gets set is that every time that this input value changes, we call this onInputChange function. And inside here, we call this setInputValue event.target.value, which is the value inside of our text input. And this function sets the value of this state variable. And now this is all going to tie back into how we use the useEffect. Because in the second parameter of the useEffect, which is an array, we can specify which variables, when their values change, do we want to update the component. So in this case, when post ID changes, that's when we want to update our component. So if we go ahead and take post ID and we paste it inside of this array, that essentially means when the value of post ID changes, we also want to run this function. So useEffect is essentially going to run this function in two instances. The first is on mount of this component, which is the first time it renders the component, as well as whenever this post ID value changes. And that's important because whenever we run this function, you notice the API call that we're making uses post ID in it. So when post ID changes, we expect to make a different API call, and that API call is essentially going to call setPost and pass in the data from that API call, which essentially changes this post variable. And this post variable is what's rendering the post that shows on the page in our HTML. So I know that's a lot, but I'm sure once you see it in the browser, it's going to make a lot more sense. So let's go ahead and save our code and let's go back to our browser. So here you can see we have our label that says enter a post ID and then our text input, as well as this button that says get post. And down here, by default, when we mount the component, we're rendering the post title and the post body for the post that has ID 1. And that's because in the code, we specified that the initial value of post ID is just going to be 1. So when this useEffect runs on the onMount, it's fetching the data for post ID 1. But now if I go in here and I enter 3 for the post ID, and then I click get post, we'll see that the post now updates to the information that's for post ID 3. If I change this to 5 and then I say get post, then you see it now changes to the title and the body for post ID 5. To understand what's happening here, if we go back to the code, whenever I change the value in the input, we run this function onInputChange, which essentially changes the value of this state variable. And then when I click this button, we call this function, which is onButtonClick, which essentially calls setPostID which changes the value of this post ID state variable. What does it change it to? It changes it to the current value of this input value, which we get from the text input. And then once this post ID changes, we're essentially telling this useEffect to trigger again, because the second parameter is an array that contains all the variables that will trigger this useEffect function. And when that happens, we make another API call to this URL, but with the post ID, with the value of post ID. That response comes back and gets turned into a JSON, and then we call setPost to save that into this post variable. Now that post variable ultimately gets rendered here in the HTML, creating this div and rendering the title and the body. So this was just a really quick example of how you can use useEffect to make async function calls to pull data from an API. This is probably one of the most common use cases that you're going to use useEffect, so hopefully you understand how it fits into the component lifecycle and how you can use it to set state variables both on mount and on update. That's all I have for you guys in this video. I'm going to leave a link in the description with the code from this tutorial. I really hope this video series is helpful, and I'm going to make more React videos in the future. If you have any questions for me, please leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.